So this was our best naval fighter at the beginning of the war, the Wildcat, and it too had retractable landing gear that had to be hand cranked up. You could find the new pilots because they would be bobbing on departure. Obviously the wings folded, and it was very inferior to the Japanese Zero, which had come along about a year after that Oscar, and there's a picture of the Zero up on the wall. That's what it looked like. It was way too heavy. It had a 1,200 horsepower engine in it, but it was heavy armored. Couldn't climb, couldn't fly as fast. There were no benefits over the Zero. So later Admiral John Thatch, and what you would do is you'd fly when you were under attack, you'd fly in a defensive mode with your wingman, and you'd be a certain distance away, and if the Japanese followed you, a pilot would follow you, and you'd go like this. Your wingman was coming around and would be head on with the Japanese as he went by, and so in perfect position to shoot. So no matter which plane you followed, the other guy would get the guy trying to shoot you down, and it took the Japanese a long time to figure out why they were losing a lot of pilots. And that was it, because of the tactics. The other thing that happened is that Grumman, who made this plane, heard about how well it wasn't doing against the Zero, so Pratt & Whitney had developed the R2800 engine, which I'll show you in a minute. They built a fighter that looked similar to this around that engine. This had a 1,200 horsepower engine in it. One of the favorite tactics of the Japanese, they had been fighting in China and experience and all that, and we were very rookie. They would actually get in front of us in a Zero, and then they would zoom straight up. And if the Wildcat pilot was silly enough to follow, he would zoom straight up, and then his 1,200 horsepower engine would basically not cut it, and they would fall down as you normally would. Well, the Japanese Zero would keep going, and then it would fall off, and it would be right on the tail of the Wildcat, and that's how they would get them. And so one Japanese tried it with the F6 Hellcat that came after this, and they had the 2,000 horsepower engine, and it was still coming, and so we started blasting the heck out of them that way. This is famous in another way. This is a lawyer by the name of Easy Eddie, and Easy Eddie was a famous lawyer in St. Louis, and he caught the eye of this gentleman, Al Capone, Mr. Gangster, and he hired him and brought him to Chicago, and Easy Eddie always got him off, and so he paid him $100,000, a lot of money in those days, and he had a city block home, but Easy Eddie didn't like what it was doing to the family name because he had a young son, and so he turned state's evidence against Al Capone and put him away for 3 years for tax evasion. And later on, when he got out, he had Easy Eddie killed, and Easy Eddie died at age 46. If you fast forward to the South Pacific, there was a naval aviator by the name of Butch that flew these Wildcats, and he was on a mission to fly to go find the bad guys, and his crew chief hadn't filled up his gas tank all the way. So he sent him home, and on the way home, he ran into 9 Japanese planes coming to bomb the USS Lexington, and he was the only airplane they had to defend. And in 4 minutes, he shot down 4 of them. He rammed one, sending it out of the skies, and then the rest went home. And when he landed, it was outside the carrier, but when he landed, all this gun footage film showed what had happened. He became the first naval aviator in World War II to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. Well, he was killed, sadly, a year later in a night action by friendly fire. So after the war, the people of Chicago were so happy for what he had done, they renamed the airport Butch O'Hare International Airport, and he was Easy Eddie's son.
The one that got killed by Al Capone?
Yes.
Wow.
Isn't that quite a story?
That's totally amazing.
This is one of the prettiest airplanes I think ever designed. It was designed right here in Washington State, the University of Washington. And it was flown by Pappy Boyington, the guy that showed you that used to be a Flying Tiger, and this is what he got most of his victories in the South Pacific. There was a TV show in the late 70s called Black Sheep Squadron. Robert Conrad played the pilot, and he was copying Pappy Boyington. So the whole reason why it has the dip in the wing, it had this 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800, and a 13.5-foot prop. And if he had straight wings, when he designed it, the landing gear would be too fragile to keep crashing down on the carrier. So he just bent the wing to make it shorter so it would be stronger. and there's no aerodynamic reason he bent the wings other than that.
Just for landing gear.
Just for landing gear.
Yeah.
So people always wondered what the significance of that was. It was just to make sure that the prop could clear the, come crashing down and prop could clear the deck. But this had it had made a noise when it flew fast, and it had, they call it the whistling death the Japanese did. It was a tremendous plane. It had such a long nose on it, though. They had really a lot of difficulty landing on carriers, because you would do a normal pattern like on land. For a carrier, you would go like this, base and then final. They raised the cockpit on later models, and they shortened the nose a bit, but they kept it on the ground using by the Marine Corps in the islands until they could perfect that. And then they started making sweeping turns to land on carriers instead of square ones, so you could keep the ship in focus until you lost it at the tail end. So that's how they finally figured out how to land this thing on an aircraft carrier. This particular one was, I was in a gentleman's office in 1999, and he was had a picture of this plane on the wall, and I said, well, tell me about that. Are you a pilot? And he says, no, I'm not a pilot, but my brother and I were helping the Museum of Flight restore it, because this had been in an air crash off of over Lake Washington here in Seattle, where there was a Sandpoint Naval Air Base at the time, and both pilots got out okay, but it sank down to 200 feet. And so in the early 80s, we pulled it off the lake bed down from 200 feet and then restored it. And he and his family were helping the museum fund and work on the restoration. Well, his brother was a naval aviator, and he went back to base after working on it one summer, and he was killed in the midair. And so it's actually 89 is the year his brother died, and S on the tail stands for Shukart, so it's in honor of Lieutenant J.G. Jerome Shukart. So it's a small world when you ask about a picture on the wall.
Wow.
But still one of the prettiest and best airplanes ever built. And Pappy Boynton, who flew it in the South Pacific, was also a graduate of the University of Washington. So the designer and here's a picture of Boynton back in the day with his Black Sheep Squadron. I met him before he died one time in the late 70s. He was always in trouble. He was always half drunk. He wanted to fight all the time, but he was a great leader. He got shot down late in the war, and he was captured, and he went to the same prison camp as Louis Lampanini did, the guy of Unbroken. But he survived it well because they honored his 28 victories, and they let him peel potatoes, so he came back fatter than he was when he left. And then after the war, President Truman gave him the Congressional Medal of Honor for his deeds. This is the largest fighter of any nations in World War II. And I always get questioned about the guns, why they're different sizes. Well, it's just the feed for the ammo. They're staggered in the wing, but they're all the same length. But this had 8 50 caliber machine guns versus the normal 6 that we would have in our. We chose the 50 caliber as the weapon of choice, both in World War II and Korea. The British started out with rifle bullets, 303s, and they had 8 machine guns, and the Germans would go back peppered like hell, but it didn't have any stopping power. And then the Germans had a cannon or two. They all armed their planes differently throughout the war, but that Bf-109 had a cannon. One of them had a cannon right through the hub. That one didn't. That had 2 in the wings, but it had 2 50 caliber machine guns, roughly 12.7. But the British finally up-armored themselves. This was so powerful, it blew up like 16,000 locomotives in ground attack role. But it was so big it scared most pilots when they first got in it, but it actually was a great flying machine. This guy, Robert S. Johnson, was the stationed in England, and he was flying over France with his wingman one day, and 16 German fighters jumped them, shot his wingman down right away, and then shot up his plane pretty bad. He had oil coming over, his cylinders were not running. He had a cannon shell lodged in the rail behind his cockpit, so he couldn't get out. So he just thought he was going to be dead, and the German commander sent all of his other folks home and said, I'll take care of this guy, and he emptied his ammo into the plane and couldn't shoot it down. So he actually had to be cut out of it back when he landed in England. And later on he shot down 26 of them, so they should have tried harder. But it was just a great airplane. It was easy to fly. It just was intimidating as hell. but it didn't have the range to go all the way to Berlin for the B-17 escorts, as the later plane, the P-51 did, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Hal, man, I can't believe you're taking all this time.
Well, you're what we're here for. So this is the model collection that we first got from Dr. Holtgrew. He says his wife's going to kill me, and we get that all the time. You'll see models around here all the time, but he researched these things, and they're painted accurately. Some of them are kits, but some of them aren't. They're 1/72nd, and here's a picture of Dr. Holtgrew.
This is all his stuff. All this
Yeah,
also.
yeah. There he is, and.
He probably had a paint booth in his surgery office.
I know. Well, he said he did build them between surgeries. And some of them I'd have a hard time identifying what they are unless I looked them up.
I would.
To BF-109. And this one was found in a field in Siberia and had been sabotaged by the pilot so it wouldn't go into German hands. He had put a grenade in his cockpit and one in the engine, and it was restored in Russia, and and we have it. It's one of the only restored yaks. It's the only one in the United States, actually, but it was actually quite a good airplane. They had some good airplanes for what they had to do.
I've seen a lot of MiG 15s, 17s, 21s.
Yeah, we have those. So this is my favorite airplane, and it's
of course
the P-51 now. You may know the story of how it started, but Dutch Kindelberger was running this new airplane company called North American, and the British came to him asking him to build P-40s on contract because Curtiss was building them for our Army Air Force and had no production time, and they needed more airplanes. And so Kindelberger convinced him that on a cocktail napkin that I can build a better airplane than that. And in 120 days, they came up with the prototype of this. And one of the things that it did different than everything else, it had a laminar flow wing, which was thicker in the middle than on the front edge, and it was really a good wing, and it made it go fast. But they were putting the Allison engines in it, and the Allison engines that were like that one right over there, and in the P-40, they were okay airplanes at low altitude, but they weren't turbocharged. And so they didn't perform in high altitude. And Europe is all about high altitude. All the combat was done at high altitude over there. And so the British, on their own, stuck a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in this to see what it would do, and it just transformed it. So during World War II, we made these in Inglewood and Dallas, Texas, and Packard Motor Company built the Rolls-Royce Merlin and put it in this under license to Rolls-Royce. And this became the best fighter of the war. You can debate that, and you say the German 262 jet should be the best, but this did more work than that did, and it came along in time to make a difference. It could go with its external fuel tanks. It could fly the B-17s all the way to Berlin and back, and so it escorted them and really cut down the B-17 pilot crew loss. It did have all airplanes have advantages and disadvantages. It's a liquid cool engine, so you had your radiator down here. So it wasn't really good for ground attack missions. If some of the people shooting up and they got a bullet in your bottom side there and hit a line, they could lose your coolant, the engine overheats, it's gone. So Major Bruce Carr was flying a mission in a plane like this out of France, and he was basically flying a mission over what was then Yugoslavia, and it was all German occupied. He's doing ground attack targets of value kind of things, and he got a bullet in his radiator apparently because his temperature was going crazy. So he climbed to altitude and knew what was going to happen. He was going to bail out, and sure enough, the engine just kind of went clunk, and he trimmed it and put a nice glide, and then stepped over the side and pulled his parachute. He's coming down. And in the far distance, he sees a German air base he hadn't seen. And he goes, I'm going to try and surrender over there because they'll treat me better than the soldiers that I just shot up. So it takes him about a week to get there. And he gets there right at dusk. And so he goes over he goes over the fence and climbs in the cockpit of one to fall asleep. He says, I'll do all this in the morning, I'm tired. Wakes up, the sun's beating down in the cockpit, it's warm and all that stuff, and no one's around. And he goes, you know, if I could figure out how to fly this, I'm a pilot. So he says, well, the American crew chiefs always turn all the switches off, so maybe the Germans are the same way, I'll just turn everything on. And he does, and things come alive and all that. And there's like a ball pump handle. And he pulls it out and pushes it in, and it's an inertial starter, and it started the engine. Now he's sitting there, it's 5 in the morning or whatever, and it's going around, and everyone's sleeping, and he actually he says, I didn't have the nerves to taxi to the runway, so I just took off between the barracks and off I went. And it took him a while to get the airplane cleaned up, figure out where the switches were and stuff, and he did. And he's flying back to his base. He looks around and no one's following him, and so he flies back to his base. He's feeling pretty good. Then he realizes he has another problem. He's in a German plane coming back to an American base. He doesn't have a parachute, so he can't bail out. And so, sure enough, he tries to wag his wings and all that kind of stuff, and he can't find the gear switch because it's not the same one that makes it go up, it's a different one, and to get it down. So they're shooting at him, and he just bellies it in next to the runway, and so it comes to a stop. MPs come, and the wing commander comes out and looks down and says, Bruce, what the heck are you doing in a German plane? He was the only pilot in World War II to take off in his own country's plane and come back in someone else's.